Let me read to you a passage from the 23rd chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, verses 1 to 12. It's the Gospel for Tuesday of the second week of Lent. St. Matthew writes, Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for men to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honour at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted in the marketplaces and to have men call them Rabbi. But you are not to be called Rabbi, for you have only one teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth your father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called Master, for you have one Master, the Christ. The greatest among you will be your servant. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." That's from Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 to 12, speaking to us of Christian humility. What do I mean? Well, one of the intriguing things in world history is the emergence of the West as the dominant cultural force across the globe. While classical Rome dominated the civilized world for centuries, by the 5th and 6th centuries it was in tatters, a smoking ruin due to the pummeling by the barbarian hordes. Its demise heralded the Dark Ages, which involved centuries of struggle amid all kinds of setbacks. Europe at this time, the late Dark Ages, could not rival the culture and power of, say, the Islamic world. For instance, it was from Islamic culture that the West recovered the writings of Aristotle, and much that it would use for its own intellectual resurgence. Gradually, with Charlemagne and the early Middle Ages, Christian Europe emerged. Now, this is not the place to trace in detail the gradual rise of the West following the first millennium, but the question may be asked, what were the factors which led the West to become so dominant? Well, many observers are of the opinion that the West is on the brink of a gradual decline. They think that the West is culturally exhausted and morally confused. It lacks confidence in its religious roots and its philosophical heritage. It does not believe it is legitimate to stand for anything definite if this involves a negative judgment on the perspectives of others. Philosophical relativism holds the field, and the way seems wide open for fundamentally different visions of reality to gain the victory. For instance, Islam seems to be a serious challenge facing secular France. If the West does not recover the sources of its strength, it may be on the brink of a significant decay. So then, what was the reason for the rise of the West? Now, in anything like this, it is always instructive to hear what outside observers have to say, especially if those observers represent a future challenge. I remember a priest who taught modern history saying in the late 1950s that China would be the coming dominant power. Many think that the growing power of China, gradual, fitful, yet perhaps unstoppable, may be equipping it to take the lead in the century to come. Now, there are some in China who have things to say about the rise of the West. A former editor of the Sunday Telegraph, Dominic Lawson, in a review in the Sunday Times of Niall Ferguson's new book entitled Civilization, the West and the Rest, carries a quote from a member of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, in which that Chinese scholar tries to account for the success of the West to date. He said, One of the things we were asked to look into was what accounted for the success, in fact the preeminence, of the West all over the world. We studied everything we could from the historical, political, economic and cultural perspective. In the past 20 years, we have realized that the heart of your culture is your religion, Christianity. That is why the West is so powerful. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. We don't have any doubt about this. Now, I'm not in any way suggesting that this sums up the whole matter, nor that Ferguson, whose book Lawson reviewed when citing this Chinese observation, would in any way agree with the Chinese academician. However, it does illustrate the fact that Christianity has been an absolutely essential element in the formation of the soul of Europe, and therefore of the West. Now, why am I making this general point? Well, I simply wish to highlight the distinctiveness of the Christian picture of the good man. The Christian idea of what is good, preferable, and in the long run most valuable, has shaped the intellect and the soul of the West and contributed to its flourishing. And this brings us to our gospel passage today from Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 to 12, in which Christ speaks of a virtue which will scarcely be found in pages and figures outside divine revelation, and in particular outside the person and the teaching of Jesus Christ. I refer to Christ's exaltation of the virtue of humility. Now, this is not just any kind of humility. It is the humility of Christ, a virtue that is fundamental among those virtues that make up the picture of Christian goodness. And I'm certainly not saying that the West is notable in its living of this Christian virtue. However, it has been part of the idea of the good and holy man which Western culture at its best, not at its materialistic and secular worst, has brought to the world. This, though, is not a matter of mere academic reflection. The Christian is called to be a light in the world and the salt of the earth. This he will be to the extent that he lives as Christ lived by the aid of his grace. The greatest thing we can do for our world, for our culture, for our society, and for all men is to follow Jesus Christ in our everyday life. He is the good and holy man, and as is said to one inquirer, no one is good but God alone. He, though, is God. Christ is the answer to the world's need, and in our gospel today he stresses the path to an authentic rise, humility. If the West and if the rest of the world is to rise, that is to say, if it is truly to flourish, let it take the path of Christ, and this will mean following him in his humility.